Afternoon, everybody. When I was a student, I was at Cambridge, and I played rugby for Cambridge, and it's very difficult for me to be here without making some sort of snide remark about the second best university in the country or something. So I won't do that. Thank you. I wanted to talk about a conundrum that the fact that business leaders are generally very well educated and smart and rational, and our leading politicians are generally very well educated and smart and rational, often educated here or in my alma mater, and yet we seem to really struggle to make the necessary interventions to bring about systemic change on challenging issues like climate change. And I'm going to talk about that through the work of Women in Business, but it's very much informed by sort of insights from the fields of complex adaptive systems and cognitive science, particularly thinking about non-linearities and cognitive biases. So I want to just share some of how the Women in Business work and how we've worked with some of those ideas over the years, and what we think works and what doesn't work, and some of the things that we think we're up against, and maybe then in particular think about how do we think about and work with the future. Because anyone who's trying to change the direction of society or the direction of the economic system is working with the future. I observe that we actually struggle to work with the future in a very rigorous, certainly a very effective way. So let me start with the kind of birth of Women in Business. Women in Business, as Felix said, is a coalition of NGOs working with businesses on climate change, trying to accelerate action on climate change. And we're a coalition, and we were born a couple of years before Paris when two very influential chief sustainability officers, Steve Howard from IKEA and Hannah Jones from Nike, asked a group of us to dinner. And you know, those sort of influential people that you always say yes to dinner, but what we didn't know was we were going to kind of be told off. What their basic pitch was, you guys are all doing brilliant work. CDP, the World Business Council, BSR, the B Team, Ceres in America, the Climate Group, the Prince of Wales Corporate Leaders Group on climate change based out of Cambridge. But we're losing the battle. In fact, we're losing the war to very well-funded Koch Brothers type strategic communications, which are basically just propagating two very simple messages. One, you can't trust the scientists. You'll remember the email gate. And two, don't mess with something that's given us all this. The sort of sense that why would we radically transform an economic system that's given us so much material wealth? Oh, and by the way, which is necessary to give material wealth to those in markets and in countries in the world who don't have it yet. You know, quite an incredibly audacious argument, actually. And Stephen had said, and the reason you guys are not breaking through is, although you're all doing individually good work, it just doesn't add up. You know, the whole is less than the sum of the parts, and it needs to be greater than the sum of the parts. You know, there's a sort of tendency to compete amongst these good little NGOs rather than actually come together to form a movement. So they encouraged us to come together then, and to shortcut to Paris, our basic remit was to bring the voice of the silent majority of business leaders who understood that climate was a real issue, who were already committed to action, and who wanted bold political leadership to make it easier for them to continue their action, to bring that to the political process, in particular to bring it to Paris. So we launched a series of campaigns which are about businesses making bold commitments to the full transformation rather than incremental commitments. And we used those to try and influence the political space around, leading up to and in Paris. So we went to Paris with just a little leaflet with like eight things that business want from Paris, very specific asks in the language of the negotiators. So not in the language of business, but translated into paragraph 2, paragraph 3.2, the very specific language of the targets, of the ratchet period, of carbon markets, etc. And we then deployed all of our teams and the many businesses who were able to get to Paris to go around talking to all of the negotiators, saying this is what business wants from Paris. Like, it wants a bold target, it wants 5-year ratchets, it wants the ability to use market mechanisms, etc. And I don't know if any of you have ever been to a conference of the parties, as they're called. It's a kind of a mad process with thousands and thousands of people running around, and big rooms and smaller rooms and smaller rooms, and the real work, of course, gets done in back rooms, as so often in a complex negotiation. And we worked very closely with Christiana Figueras, who of course was the kind of master orchestrator of the theatre of of Paris, to bring this positive voice of business in and literally mobilize CEOs to come to send this kind of message, not just through the NGOs. And then it's a 2-week process, and the very good friend of mine, Tom Karnak, was working for Christiana as her strategy advisor. And so we were in very frequent touch, and it was I did about 10K a day walking up and down these huge halls. And about 36 hours before the final plenary session, when we hoped that a deal would be agreed, I got a phone call. And I looked at it and it said, Tom. So I picked the phone up and said, hi Tom, what's up? And then this little Hispanic voice said, it's not Tom, it's Christiana. I don't know if any of you have ever met Christiana. She's quite, apart from being a ferocious diplomat, she's also got quite a cheeky sense of humour. I said, oh, Christiana, how can I help you? And she said, that's the point, Nigel. I've just rung to say thank you for helping me. And that was a point that I knew that we were going to have a deal, and a good deal. And it still brings goosebumps. Because what Christiana Figueres and Manuel Pulgar Vidal and Lawrence Toubiana, really the real architects of Paris, did was to completely change the negotiating politics around climate. And it started a few years before with the recognition that a top-down approach that as had been tried in Copenhagen wouldn't work. I mean, getting 195 sovereign states to agree what everyone else was going to do is an almost impossibly complex negotiation. So that led to the bottom-up approach that we have now, which, flawed though some of you might think it is much better than another failed top-down approach. But what they also realised was that this was not about nation states alone, that this, what we now often call non-state actors, would really have to bring their voice in, and started with the then Secretary General in Poland 3 years before, bringing a small group of us into the room saying, how do we get the voice of business into the process, not in the legal process as parties, and of course the voice of investors, the voice of mayors, the voice of governors of states and regions as well. So that was good, and since then we're all working now to use the same power of the voice of business to try and accelerate ambition and ratchet policies. And I wanted to just briefly talk about the kind of basic approach that we take as a coalition. So I want to talk about sort of 5 pillars of our approach. And then I'm going to focus in particular about how we think about and engage with the future as the sort of 5th pillar. So I've given these pillars some names. So the first one is what I call anti-Python. The second one, nowhere to hide. The third one, the right to advocate. The 4th, ambition loop. And the 5th, reflexive futures. So this is about the way that we work with businesses to try and accelerate action on climate change. So the first one is what I call anti-Python. I don't know, is The Life of Brian still a cult film? Or do you have to be in my generation to... No. So there's a very famous, it's a Monty Python film. For those of you who know it already know the scene I'm talking about. Those of you who don't know it, you should really look it up. There's a very famous scene in the Life of Brian when these activists, these anti-Roman Empire activists, are meeting in the amphitheatre, and they're kind of discussing tactics. But basically what they're doing is they're just criticising each other. It's kind of the People's Front of Judea or the Judea People's Front, arguing about who's helping and who's splitting factions. And the absurdity is that they're groups of like 2 or 3 people against the whole of the Roman Empire. And any of you who've ever worked in any kind of campaign or movement building activity will recognise that this is a very familiar pattern. We see it we see it today, I think, on the left of British politics. You know, things crumbling apart. So the first thing that we did as a coalition was to figure out how to move from being fragmented and all being committed to action on climate change, but kind of competing in a way where the whole ended up being less than the sum of the parts. So we practice what we call radical collaboration. It means, first of all, aligning messaging, so that everybody's saying basically the same simple messages, you know, because that sense of surround sound and repetition is really important. So secondly, allocating responsibility. So instead of running 7 separate renewable energy campaigns, saying, okay, the climate group will lead, CDP will give technical support, and everyone else will then aggregate all of their members and their power behind that, so that we got the chance of getting to scale. It's a kind of a network effect as well, right? If you have lots of good campaigns that all get 10 companies to commit, it never creates the kind of compelling scale which starts to draw other companies in and says, oh, there's something big going on here, because individually they're all quite small. When you get one campaign that starts to have 100 big companies in, it starts to be something that attracts attention of other businesses, so it has a snowball effect, and then of policymakers, because it's big enough to pay up and take notice. So that's the first one, what I call anti-Python. Second one is nowhere to hide. Steve Howard talks about this as saying, if you make a commitment as a company to 70% improvement in something, more than 30% of the people think they don't have to change. It's the same in any group. You know, if you have a group of academics who 50% commit to lose weight, or a group of students who 50% commit to do something, it's just human behaviour that everyone else thinks that somebody else will do most of the work, and they won't have to do it. It's called the bystander problem in terms of cognitive psychology. Steve said, unless we commit to 100%, then there will be more than the remainder thinking that they don't have to act. So that was what led to this campaign we call RE100, getting companies to commit to 100% renewable energy. In 2014, that was an entirely radical idea. It's quite normal now. That's part of the progress I think we've made. So nowhere to hide means making the full commitment: zero deforestation, 100% renewable energy, zero carbon economies. The third one is called earning the right to advocate. Before we formed the coalition, most of the policy advocacy that went on even from I'd say the most progressive business NGOs. Of course, you can be a non-business NGO and just tell governments what they need to do. That then doesn't have the power of the business voice, which is a disproportionately powerful voice in policy circles. But what we found was most of the requests for policy change from business were, we the undersigned, recognising that climate change is a really serious issue and has economic consequences, commit to doing what we can to amend it and ask for the following policies. But it was very vague in terms of commitment. So by earning the right to advocate, we mean that we think it's only really powerful and compelling for a business to start telling politicians what policies they need to change when the business itself has made ambitious commitments, is investing, is innovating, is in action. So we talk about this continuum from ambition to action to advocacy, and it's only really when a company can plausibly point to its transformational ambition and the action en route to that ambition that it's really qualified, that it's really earned the right to advocate. The fourth is what we call the ambition loop. That's, you quite often hear very simple polarized views that either it's all about regulation or you just got to leave it to the market. I mean, the extreme of the latter would be in Silicon Valley, where there's this kind of very strong sort of anti-government vibe that you just got to let businesses get on with it. And then there are some people who say we've just got to regulate everything, business will never do anything. We very strongly believe in what we call an ambition loop, it's a positive feedback loop. As you get more and more ambitious businesses, it changes the political context. It makes it easier for policymakers to be bolder. And of course, as you get bolder policy, it raises the floor, which allows the leading businesses to then raise the bar. So that's a really important positive feedback. And of course, the default often is the negative version of that. It's right, low ambition, very little policy move, and just kind of hovering around at origin. And the fifth pillar of our approach is what I call reflexive futures. Those of you who are familiar with George Soros's work, and he particularly is an advocate of this, the idea that there's a reflexive relationship between what we think about the future and what actually happens in the future, and it's mediated through what we do today. So in other words, what we do today is influenced by what we think is going to happen in the future. So this is why I want to spend the rest of the time talking about how do we think about the future, because it really matters. It's not an abstract issue of whether we think that it's possible to get to net zero by 2050 or not. It's a very concrete issue of what we actually do today, because if we know that it's not possible, we won't act as though it was possible. If we know that it is possible, or we believe that it is possible, it will influence what we do today. So there are lots of ways in which an incumbent system, those with a vested interest in the status quo, and just us as human beings who struggle to manage change, get in the way of creating a positive reflexive future, i.e. a positive image of what is possible, desirable, even likely, that then influences our action today. So I'm going to start with some of these traps and then I want to talk about some of the ways in which we try to overcome them. So that all the traps to stop us tapping into the power of a positive reflexive future they're all negative. They're about, it's not possible, it's not desirable, it's not necessary, all those kind of things, right? Which just mean that you don't even engage with the possibility. So the first one is what I call the sort of the Pangloss approach. Voltaire's Candide, Dr. Pangloss, all will be for the best and the best of all possible worlds, just assuming that everything's going to work out fine. That's the approach that the oil and gas industry have taken for several decades around CCS, and they've actually managed to capture the policy-making influence of the IEA, so that we end up with this very big rounding number which says, oh, and then the CCS miracle happens and we don't have to worry. Okay, so this sort of Panglossian approach that don't worry, everything will be all right, which often is prefaced with the energy system's much more complicated than you could understand, so there's often a patronising preface to that. But be very aware of anyone telling you that we don't have to change. I'm guessing that if all of you are members of the society here, that very few of you would fall for that. But notice it. It's more prevalent than you might believe. The other one is a term I just came across today for a phenomenon we've been aware of a long time called the predatory delay. This is the way in which industry groups often work to slow down needed policy changes. The very real examples right now would be the way that the Alliance of Auto Manufacturers in the States and then the Auto Industry Lobbying Group in Europe have lobbied to try and limit fuel efficiency ambition. So in the States, that's meant rolling back the Obama-era EPA emissions standards, and in Europe, it's meant lobbying for much lower fuel efficiency improvements by 2030. And the argument always goes something like this. We understand the industry better than anyone else does, because we are the industry. So politicians, NGOs, academics don't understand it. We're the only ones who understand it. So first of all, we're the only ones who are qualified to speak about it. Second of all, the change which you are proposing, foolishly, would bankrupt the industry, would send jobs overseas, it would be a disaster economically. So in Europe, we have this very perverse situation where most of the vehicle manufacturers have been saying more or less that they will be 25% electrified in their vehicle fleet by 2025. Now, obviously, all other things being equal, that means a 25% reduction in fuel emissions, because those ones go from whatever they were to zero. At the same time, the industry group was telling policymakers that anything as much as a 20% by 2030 reduction in fuel efficiency standards would be very, very difficult for the industry to handle, and anything more than that would be disastrous. In fact, we've ended up with 37.5%. And in part, I've come to realise, because there's a sort of perverse dance that politicians and lobbyists end up learning to do together, where the politicians actually sometimes want the lobbying organisations to lowball it, so they can then say politically that they are the ones who got the industry to change when they didn't want to. And I think that dance, that learned behaviour, is probably fine in times of incremental change. When you're arguing about 2% versus 3%. But when we're talking about the kind of disruptive change, when we're talking about the end of the internal combustion engine and the scale and speed of change needed to address climate change, it doesn't serve either the industry or society well. It doesn't serve society well because it means we get the wrong climate change trajectory, and it doesn't serve the industry well because it means that those governments who have realised that this change needs to take place, like the Chinese, are implementing industrial policies and industrial strategies which will strengthen their industries for the global market and for electric vehicles. The third one is just a straightforward cognitive bias that's called negativity bias, which is particularly prevalent in the press. There's a phrase in the press to talk about what gets chosen for the front page and headline. It says, if it bleeds, it leads. So the press are biased towards telling us bad things. And that's the general consensus seems to me is that has a sort of Neolithic evolutionary benefit for us. Like if you're going to pay attention to the lion that might kill you, or the mammoth that might feed you, if you have to be biased towards one, you're better off be biased against the existential risk, because if you get it wrong, then you're not around for the positive. So there might have been a reason for that. But it means that our news is very skewed towards negatives. You see this a lot in the coverage of innovative new technology. So you'll see the press talk a lot more around the bankruptcies of solar companies than around the growth of solar companies. So at the same time we have this sort of excitement of Schumpeterian disruption, and we know that when we have new technologies that there will be 1,000 flowers blooming and then many companies will go bust and the leaders will rise. Nevertheless, the press prefers to talk about the negatives because that's because of that bias. There's another very obvious kind of logical fallacy, the ad hominem. That's the attack of scientists for supposed communications in emails. It's another classic trick to avoid actually talking about the argument. Two others. Well, I've mentioned the never had it so good. I mean, it really is remarkable, right, that we know that 7 million people a year die because of air quality problems, and yet a lobbyist can have the audacity to say that because of the same industry that causes that, or only the same industry that causes that, could be the source of economic growth to get people out of poverty around the world. So it's a very pernicious argument. And the last one, which some of you here may or not may be involved in, is the hegemony of bad models. And this happens in two different ways. One is the sort of political capture, like the IEA with the CCS, very high levels of CCS as a kind of rounding number, as though it was as realistic as every other number in the model. But in a way, the more worrying one I see is the tendency to allow very complex integrated assessment models, which try and model technology and economy together, to give politicians the impression of predictive accuracy. And my favourite example of this is a report which Mercer, who are consultants for the pension industry, did a few years ago, looking at some different scenarios of climate change and climate change policy, and what the impact would be on investment portfolios. And they use integrated assessments models to model likely future carbon pricing trajectories. And I say it all looks very rigorous because there's lots of there's thousands of lines of code, lots of significant figures, and at the end, in the footnote, there's a line saying, this bit of work has been done using the best integrated assessment models, but it should be noted that they're not able to include all variables, including politics and entrepreneurial behaviour. So apart from possibly the two biggest forces dictating the direction of the economy and technology on climate change, they're a really good benchmark. Let me finish this by saying some of the ways in which we try to tackle those biases or those ruses which stop us believing that change is possible or necessary or even inevitable. And the first one I'd say is simply to paint a compelling pathway to change. Now, actually, it means the hard, rigorous, intellectual work of saying, no, it is possible, and here you go. Something, for example, that Greenpeace did a long time ago with a scenario which said we could get to 100% renewables. The difficulty with someone like Greenpeace doing that is that most politicians and most business leaders won't pay attention to that, because they'll say, well, you would say that anyway. So one of the things that I've been involved in over the last few years is an organisation called the Energy Transitions Commission, which brought together the CEOs of energy businesses, materials businesses, and some of the NGOs like me working on the solutions to say what is possible and what is necessary in terms of the energy transition. And the fact that the CEOs of power utilities and cement companies, etc., sign up to something which says we need to reduce oil demand by 30% by 2040 garners a lot more attention. I mean, that's the sort of front page of the FT. Of course, it wouldn't be a surprise that I would say that, right? So the FT doesn't write about my opinion, it writes about the CEOs of those energy and materials companies. So that's the first thing, is being really clear on the pathway to the future. And then linked to that is finding what John Elkington calls a zero naught, like the first CEO who's prepared to commit to getting to zero. So, I mean, a good example of that would be this latest report, Mission Possible, by the Energy Transition Commission, which talks about the heavy emitting sectors and shows that there's a possible pathway to get to net zero by 2050 in all those sectors: cement, steel, chemicals, and heavy transport. And then you get the CEO of Maersk saying they'll get to zero carbon shipping by 2050, and the CEO of Dalmir Cement saying they'll get to zero by 2040. Suddenly, it changes the way. That doesn't mean it will happen, right? Let's not be naive, but it means that people will take seriously the possibility that it could happen. So it changed. Before that report and Dalmir Cement, the IEA talked about a well below 2 degree scenario, meaning 24% per tonne reduction in emissions for cement. So there's a world of difference between 24% per tonne and getting to zero. So compelling pathways to the future and zero noughts. Then I think, for those of you who are interested in the modelling, there's a really nice article written by Michael Grubb at UCL recently about taking more of an empirical approach to technological transformation. We actually know pretty well how technological transformation happens, the pattern that it goes through. You know, it's an S curve, it goes exponential, and then it starts to flatten out as it gets high penetration. It's incredible how often you will hear someone say that because we're only at 1 or 2% electric vehicles by market share, it's going to take forever. Where does that come from? It comes from a very simplistic, linear understanding of the way systems change. And we know that's not the way that new technologies break through. And actually, you can look back historically at many, many transitions and see them. And you can look back at that particular one and see that we've been more than doubling the market share of electric vehicles every 2 years for the last 10 years. Of course, you start off 0.01%, no one's noticing, right? You get to 0.02% in 18 months, it's still tiny, right? But now you get to like 8% in China, 2% in Europe. If you're still doubling in less than 2 years, you know, 8%, you're at 32% in 4 years. Now maybe you're getting towards the top of the S-curve and you're flattening off, but you won't be at 3 or 4%. So being aware of empirically of the way that these sort of socio-technical transitions take place is really important, and not talking about them as though 2 or 3% is trivial, but following the exponential maths and educating people on the exponential maths if they've forgotten how to do it. I think linked to that is because that kind of exponential growth often appears to come from nowhere, because 2% isn't very noticeable, but 16% is. Paying real attention to the positive stories at the early stages of transitions and paying attention to them, looking for, because the press often won't do it, right? So paying attention to them, finding them, sharing them, telling people, finding out how fast the cost of battery packs is going down, finding out how fast the share of electric vehicles is going up, making sure people know, extrapolating it yourself and saying, if that continued for another 10 years, we'd be at 100% before the end of the 20s. So, how are we doing for time? Right, so I wanted to wrap up by just reminding you how fast the future can accelerate. So we tend to forget what we thought about the future 2 or 3 years ago. Because especially if we were wildly wrong, it's a bit embarrassing, so we forget that, right? And so we know now what we know about the future. So let me give you 3 examples of just how quickly our expectations of the future have accelerated on climate change in the last 3 years. So the first one is, first one I mentioned, right? This heavy industry, and I think it's very exciting because we've come late to heavy industry. You know, most people have taken the Pareto approach. They've looked at energy and transport. A lot of emphasis has gone on energy and transport. Now we can see quite good progress there. A lot of people are waking up to heavy industry and the food-land nexus as the 2 big sources of emissions that don't have a lot of great progress. Literally a year ago, I would have said you'd have really struggled to find anyone, even in the climate community, who said that it was possible to get to net zero emissions for heavy transport, steel, cement and chemicals by 2050. All the modelling said it wasn't possible. If at all, it was going to be 2070, 2080 with an awful lot of offsets or CCS. This report was published last year. The Global Climate Action Summit in San Francisco in September saw Anand Mahindra, the CEO of the Mahindra Group, commit the whole group to being net zero by 2040. They include vehicle production and steel manufacturing. And Mahendra Singh, the CEO of Dalmia Cement, saying the same for a cement company. So in a period of about 6 months, okay, there was an awful lot of very solid analytical work and consultation behind the scenes. But in a very short period, we've gone from the prevailing assumption being that these sectors, which account for about 30% of global emissions, were hard to abate. You know, even the phrase that was used to describe them almost let them off the hook, right? They were hard to abate, like we wouldn't be able to get to zero. Now, there are credible technological and economic pathways to zero, and there are credible leaders starting to stand up and say that they're committed to zero. So our sense of what's possible has come forward by about 30 years. You take the renewable energy and the power grid, something similar has happened. In 2016, when we started this work, we were just preparing to launch our first report, Better Energy, Better Prosperity, and we wanted to preview some of the findings around just how far intermittent renewables would be able to penetrate a grid. You know, because obviously we all know that the sun doesn't shine at night and the wind doesn't blow all the time, right? So there's a kindergarten assumption that the ability for those technologies to go beyond a certain amount in the grid will be impossible, that it'll be quite low, and most people think it's sort of 20 or 30% without really thinking very much. So we previewed this with Amber Rudd, who was then the Secretary, the Minister for Energy and Climate Change. I think probably one of the most progressive. She'd done a great job for the EU in the Paris Agreement. And we previewed, and at that point, this was about 6 months before we published, we were going to say that we thought that we could get to 50–60% intermittent penetration by 2035 at cost parity with gas, including the flexibility measures, so the demand response management, the storage, the interconnectors. We shared that with Amber Rudd and her special advisor at a dinner in June 2016, and they nearly fell off their chair. By the time we published in April 2017, we were saying we thought we could get to 80%. And now, well, by 2018, you had whole economies, like California, 5th biggest economy in the world, saying we will have a zero carbon grid by 2045. And you had the European industry body, Eurelectric, saying we think we should go for a zero carbon grid in Europe in the 2040s. So if you had read the IEA in 2015, 2016, you'd have thought that a zero carbon grid was something like 2070, 2080. Now it's becoming a reality on the statute book and in supply signals from, you know, American utilities companies say they're going to be zero carbon by the 2045, and on the demand side in terms of cities, states and companies saying they're only going to procure 100. So again, 30, 40 years acceleration. And then my favourite, because I've been banging on about it and called the fool for several years, is the end of the internal combustion engine. 2016, again, the general view was that's going to be 2060, 2070. You cannot find an automotive executive now who believes that the internal combustion engine will be a serious powertrain beyond 2040. And the date's coming forward. It's almost certainly going to be in the early 2030s. So those three, heavy industry, renewable penetration in the grid, and internal combustion engine, death of, all come forward by about 30 years in the last 2 or 3 years. How much of that do you see in the press? How much of that are you talking about? Right? That's what happens when we take seriously the need from the climate science and back ourselves in terms of the technological possibility of human invention by saying, because we have to do it, we're going to do it. And we start engaging in that enough, we realize that we can do it. In Paris, the mantra which Christiana and many of us were using was, we must, we can, we will. I think that increasingly when you look at the way business is changing its behaviour now, you'll see that the prevailing mantra behind their commitments, their actions and their advocacy is one of, we must, we can, we are. And if you're not, you're going to lose. Whether it's at a company level or an international level in terms of industrial policy. So with that, I'm open to as many questions as you have got time for. Thank you.
Brilliant, thank you so much. I think that's many reasons for hope right there, and I think a very refreshing and great viewpoint to hear. So I'll probably start off with a question that takes a step or even two back. Picking up on how you said before 2015 there was this idea of we might be losing this war. Having just heard what you said, how do you feel we're doing now? Are we winning the war against climate change, or where are we at?
Nobody knows, because we don't, the science of the climate system and the economics of the global economy are too complex for us to actually say whether or not we're going to succeed. We may have already passed tipping points that are going to run away, okay? I think if I answer the question in a way I assume it's intended, like, am I more optimistic now than a few years ago? Definitely yes, although one thing I notice is that in sort of obsessing about the spreadsheet of emissions, it's very easy to miss some of the other social and political forces. So, I think I and most of my peers, I would say, completely missed the rise of populism. Now, we may look back and say that actually Trump helped galvanize more climate leadership. Or we may look back and say Trump was the first domino that allowed Turkey and Saudi Arabia and Russia to start weakening their resolve to be committed to the multilateral process. So I think that if I look purely at businesses and the other non-state actors like cities and states and regions, and that there are 525 businesses who've committed to reducing their emissions in line with Paris. So far, only 5 countries have done that. Right, they've all committed to NDCs, but only 5 of them have been assessed by Climate Action Tracker as being adequate to the Paris goals, and they're 5 countries who add up to 0.02% of the gross world product. So we need a massive ratchet on policy as the next step. Now, my hope is that the work that many have done with businesses and with cities and states and investors will encourage more and more governments in the next 18 months between now and the COP at the end of 2020 to step up. So I'm more optimistic. As I say, lots of things. We were fighting for a 2-degree target in 2015. Everyone's forgotten that now. Now everyone's fighting for a 1.5-degree outcome. So, in many ways we've moved forward, but I think that it's still very early days. And as you know, the actual emissions profile and the policies that are in place now are still not up to the task.
And because you just mentioned authoritarianism, the changing politics that we see not only in climate but in general these days, it seems, and feel free to reject this premise if you want to, that climate policy or climate issues really are also moving more and more into the realm of high politics, and not only with Trump, obviously also with Trump, but in general, often authoritarian leaders and others as well sort of take on climate change, and it's getting more and more politicized as an issue. If you think that observation is true, do you think that helps the cause, especially also in working with businesses, or do you think we'd probably be able to achieve more if sort of these problems could be solved by, say, experts or decision makers without sort of as much public scrutiny and sort of debate about this?
Well, I mean, your last phrase just seems to me, that's just in the cloud cuckoo land, isn't it? Where on earth do we think that there's a ability to depoliticize the energy system? It's always been at the heart of our economy. It's always been at the heart of conflict. So the idea that we might find solutions to climate change with some sort of panel of experts, I think is really fantasy. It's very political, right? It's about power and money at its core. So now, I'm not sure what I follow you by high politics. I'm not sure if we call Trump and Brexit high politics. But I think that it's an interesting question. I think it can kind of go both ways, because there's and I think this is what happened with the coal commission in Germany, right? Is that the politics of incumbent jobs always trumps the politics of future jobs. I mean, you don't get a vote from somebody who might install a wind turbine in 15 years' time. You do get a vote from a miner. So that's, when I was growing up, like in the 70s, the British government threw all sorts of money at dying car businesses that was a waste of money. It was a waste of taxpayers' money, but it was because there's a loud voice of incumbent jobs rather than a panel of future jobs. Having said that, I think that the approach of business can start to depoliticize it, right? Because once it can do. I mean, one thing we found in the States, for example, is that if I look at all of the organisations in our coalition, for years we'd be going to governors of states in America saying, climate change is a really big issue, you've really got to act, making a kind of environmental case. But when we start getting, I think we've got about 160 companies committed to 100% renewable energy, and they're all big brand names like, BMW, GM, IKEA, Walmart, Kellogg, General Mills, some big Midwestern. You go to the governor of a state and say, by the way, did you know that Google, Facebook, Amazon, IKEA, Walmart, blah, 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 are all committed to only running their facilities on renewable energy? Well, you don't have to spell out that means jobs and tax revenue for the governor if they have an energy policy which will attract those businesses. There was a famous example where the CEO of Appalachian Power, it's a small power utility in the Appalachians, was asked by the governor of West Virginia to build another coal-fired power plant, and he just laughed and said, "I'm not going to do it because no one will buy the power." So I think that if business goes far enough, it can depoliticize it because it becomes so obvious. But when you're stuck in the incumbent politics, and that's really difficult. But it's difficult politics, right? It's not easy for. I'm not saying that it's not easy for a politician to say we should shut all the mines next year. I mean, that's very. They may not be around to then implement it.
Yeah, indeed. Maybe it's my last question. I got many more, but before I open up to all of you, because we want to hear your questions really. Is how do you think there's any way of engaging with sort of what we might sort of generalizingly call bad businesses? So certain, say, oil or coal companies, are there just some companies that are bound to lose out from climate policy that can never be an ally for this? Or are there any sort of strategies in which these companies as well might be turned into a positive force for this sort of mission?
Yeah, I think I could say a lot about that. There's a few things. One, I think one should be very clear-eyed about what companies who might benefit from a delayed transition are saying and doing, because they don't generally have a good track record, right? And one should be very careful to point out. I mean, I was in New York in September, and the Oil and Gas Climate Initiative, which is a group of now 13 oil CEOs, were talking about their plans to implement the Paris Agreement. And so it all sounds good, right? We're committed to doing that, playing our part, etc., etc. But then what their plans amounted to were one promoting reduction in methane leakage, which is good, right? Very high global warming potential gas. Promoting CCS and a clean tech fund for investing in clean tech. So I said, I think you have a problem with the credibility here, because the methane leakage is just good for business anyway. You're just stopping wasting of your product. So it's helpful for climate, but it's not really a challenge for the industry. CCS you've been talking about for decades, you have no credibility. And this clean tech investment fund is like less than the salaries of the CEOs. Pales into insignificance when you compare it with the upstream investment in exploration. And by the way, you're not talking about the need to reduce demand for your product. And so I think you have to I think we have to engage very. I mean, the difficulty often is you have to spend enough time to be able to tackle spurious arguments or weak arguments or misleading arguments. On the other hand, I would say I think it's really important never to assume that everybody working for, say, an oil and gas company is either stupid or evil, because it's not the case. I mean, I always think that if you had been studying geology or in the 1970s, right? Trying to do the math here. If you've been studying geology in the 1970s, right? 1980s, then a very exciting career to go into would have been the oil industry. You're going out to find the energy that is powering the growth of the world economy. It's kind of exciting, it's global, it's technically challenging. Great job. So you go and do that 30, 40 years ago, you find yourself running a company that everyone's telling you is destroying the planet. So I think you do see that as human beings, people running those businesses are really grappling with it. And one by one, you think you can see them pop and start to figure out within the constraints of an investor community who expect them just to deliver dividends every year and are not very forgiving. So I think one should be really careful to scrutinise what people say and make sure it's being matched by their actions, but I think you also be very careful not to write people off, because I firmly believe that anybody can change.
So there's a need almost for like climate solutions narratives that respect the individual life stories and backgrounds of all.
I think so. We did some research with a sort of blue chip communications consultant a couple of years ago. We were looking at how do we engage with steel, cement, electric utilities, very heavy around science-based targets. And the one thing that really stuck in my mind was, and this was an independent communications consultant speaking to C-suite in these industries about the levels of ambition. And the one that came out was somebody from a cement company who said, they, meaning everyone who's working on climate change, the Oxford Climate Society, We Mean Business, all of us, they make us feel like dirty animals. I was like, that's probably not a great place from which to commit to transformational change or to be open to learning. So I think we do have to be careful, but that's something to navigate, right? There's no point in being nicey with someone who's lying to you, but also not to assume that someone is incapable of change or unwilling to change.
Apologies, this is really interesting, so I might just ask one more follow-up question.
Is he always like this?
What could be a good narrative to, so if we have someone like an oil company or a coal company, where we do know they can't be doing what they're doing right now in 15 years' time, what could be a good narrative to tell you?
I mean, Stephen Fry did a documentary about the Great Gulf oil spill a few years ago, and he did it with ecologists, his name escapes me, one who did did a book called Last Chance to Sea with Douglas Adams, the author of Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, and they went to the Gulf to interview, the BP execs and local fishermen and blah blah. And there's a shot to camera of Stephen Fry at the end saying, in a really reflective mood, saying, I came here thinking I was going to do a really simple film, come here, interview the bad guys, the evil guys from the oil company, interview the good guys, all the people who've been hurt in the local economy. He said, I come away with a much more nuanced view. I've met some really kind of nasty people, but I've also met some great people from oil companies who've been trying to do their best in difficult circumstances. I've also met some people who are clearly defrauding the insurance locally, as well as some people. And he said, and I'm left reflecting that my whole lifestyle depends on cheap oil, because I get around by car and airplane all the time. So I always think it's quite kind of important that we recognise that it's not about one company or one sector. It's a whole system that we've evolved with, and we're all part of to a greater or lesser extent. So I think starting with that, and then recognising that we collectively have asked for cheap oil, we've asked for cheap cement, we've used it, we've benefited from it, and now we're saying, oh yeah, but I think just a little bit of compassion for the people who we've asked to do something and who've done it really well, and now we've understood the unintended consequences. That doesn't mean give them a free pass, but I think it's worth remembering that there's humans in the system and that we also have played our role in getting where we are.
Thank you. I will stop here and open up to all of you. If you have a question, just show your hand. Yes, please.
Procurement. I worked for a sizable company and it had what was called environmental policy. If you asked any of the 2,000 members of staff, none, I say this, of course somebody might have done, I doubt that any of them have read it. Part of procurement, as I understand it, is you ask whoever you're procuring your goods or services from, what's their procurement policy? And so you have the green domino effect. So it seems to me, I don't know what percentage of global business you've described as having a target of zero net carbon by 2050. But they, public authorities, NGOs, are the procurers. And the green domino could actually happen really fast if the SMEs don't get any work unless they are also green procuring.
Yeah.
So I just wonder how many of these companies actually have procurement policy in their environmental policy and implement it.
I don't know the exact number. I'm going to give a couple of sort of factoids. I mean, my last role in private sector was in an automotive component company. I ran the global supply chain, and before that I'd run factories. And it's absolutely true that if your customer says, I'm interested in something, then you get pretty interested in it. And the normal pattern is, I'm interested in and then a year or two later, I'd like to see what you're doing about, and then eventually it becomes an actual decision-making criterion, right? And for example, I saw that just, I think today, that Volkswagen have just said that they're going to start make that a requirement of their suppliers, that they also are reducing the carbon content of their components. So the two things, this Science-Based Targets initiative requires companies to set a bold target to reduce their emissions in line with Paris, including Scope 3, which is the value chain, so including upstream and downstream. So all of those companies, one way or another, will be engaging with that. How deeply they're engaging today, I won't know. When I was at CDP, one of the things I did was start a supply chain program, which now has about 120 companies, and that's specifically about engaging with those companies' suppliers. And one of the things we found is that if one customer asks a supplier to work out their carbon footprint and disclose to CDP, there's a relatively low disclosure rate. But once you get to 2 or 3 customers, it starts to become something that has a much higher rate, because they can see that it's coming from multiple customers. That's the 10-year anniversary of that program that I'm speaking at next week or the week after. It's a hugely powerful lever, as you say. I mean, Walmart set their science-based target about 4 years ago, and then within a year they'd issued what they call their gigaton challenge to get a gigaton of emissions out of their supply chain. I know that HPE are doing something similar. So there are quite a lot of companies doing that. One of the challenges often is that a lot of supply chains are quite attenuated. So you might be 2, 3, 4 steps away, and some of them end up with a lot of very small SMEs or micro SMEs, or in the case of the food industry, a lot of smallholder farmers, where it's not, it's one thing for Walmart to say to Unilever they want to reduce. It's another thing for Unilever to say to, I don't know how many million smallholder farmers, because then the whole issue of extension services and capacity. So it's a really important lever, and I think that one that investors and civil society should expect companies to be on top of, because in most sectors the actual emissions that are in the direct control of the company are a relatively small part of the total value chain, especially like retail or consumer goods. Obviously not if it's cement or electric utilities.
Yeah.
I'm interested in kind of the long time frame of these commitments, like the carbon, net zero by 2040, something like that. I wonder if there are analogies with past commitments companies have made that have that far of a reach, because in most cases, CEOs of public companies are going to be long gone by the time it happens. So I'm wondering if you've seen interesting examples of how companies can bake in that goal, whether it's in their corporate charter, or there's something they can do to kind of tie their hands and force themselves to do it, because otherwise, it's easy to make, you get a lot of political goodwill of making the commitment, but you may not be around to see it through.
Yeah, 2 things. First of all, a long-term target without kind of reasonable short and medium-term targets is obviously kind of meaningless. And that's a requirement of the Science-Based Targets initiative. And if you ever hear someone with a long-term target that sounds too good to be true, then you should ask them what the short-term target is. To slightly contradict myself, I wouldn't underestimate what a big deal it is for a CEO to make a statement like that. It's a compliance statement which will have had to go through their general counsel, because you're making a statement, a future-oriented statement about the direction of the business. And you remember, those of you who follow Elon Musk, he's had to step down as chair of Tesla because he made a statement via Twitter which he couldn't then back up, about having buyers lined up, investors lined up. So when Doug McMillan from Walmart said they were going to go to Science Project, my understanding is that they had to think through legal compliance issues in over 100 countries. So you might think it's a sort of flippant statement for political goodwill only, and by all means kick the tires on it, but don't just assume that it's greenwash without doing the homework. Because in most cases I think you'll find that it's been thought through quite a lot, and there are then very clear short and medium term targets, and of course then an expectation of transparency that it's reported on every year through CDP or other similar mechanisms. Yeah. I think the thing I'd say about that is we were talking about Maersk earlier. Why does Maersk, biggest container shipping company in the world, commit to zero carbon? I spoke to the chief sustainability officer in Katowice. Said that who'd been working on trying to get the company to make that commitment for about 5 years now. And it's a very bold commitment, right? That's reinventing shipping, right? So that ultimately it comes down to the CEO believing that will drive innovation. So there's a sense that it's going to have to happen anyway. So by being the first, we get some kudos. But the real thing is it will drive innovation because no one knows how to do it. So it's a way of kind of shaking up the company to think more innovatively about delivering what they do now better in the future. My friend Hannah Jones from Nike always used to say that. Said, look, if we look at our science-based target, we know what we're doing to get the first third. It's just scaling them up. Those are solutions that are already in place. We've got an innovation pipeline with all sorts of innovations from which we're confident the second third of reductions will come, which will be implemented in a decade's time. And we have no idea where the final third's going to come from, but we're confident that by committing to this, we'll be forced to innovate to get there.
Thank you. Yes, please.
Do companies need to change their values at all, or is it just a case of kind of innovating better and bringing more innovations to the forefront? Or are there any fundamental changes that you see that need to happen?
That's a kind of keep me up at night sort of question. Because I think that, well, you know, I think that we could technically solve climate change without a sort of transformation in corporate values or governance. But I think it could be a very fragile transformation. You could end up with a kind of societal bifurcation where we solve it by having very high-tech, low-carbon culture over here and very low-tech, low-carbon culture over here. So we have an even worse inequality now, which ultimately probably isn't sustainable because that leads to populism or even revolution or wars. So I think that there are, and when you look beyond climate change to other planetary boundaries, I think that's even more the case. So my sense is that what we actually need is a sort of return to the basic principle that the right to exist as a listed company is a charter with society, and there should be some quid pro quo, which is more than just reporting on your earnings and transparency. So I think there's some very interesting ideas around changes in governance models, like what would it, like in many Northern European countries, corporate governance requires trade union representation on the supervisory board. Why not require a representative of future generations on the supervisory board or of the environment? It's another major stakeholder who historically has had no kind of legal role in that. I mean, there's a movement now to give legal rights to nature. It's in a few countries like New Zealand, I think Ecuador and Colombia. But why shouldn't nature, which is impacted by corporate activity, have a representation on the board? That seems like kind of a wild idea, but I do think that and if we go through another global economic crisis, or we accelerate the real visceral impacts of climate change, I think that the openness to explore more models like that will grow. And there are seeds everywhere. There are examples of those kind of things happening. So I think technically probably we don't need to for climate change, but it would be really helpful if we did. But I think for broader kind of reform of capitalism so that it's sustainable within other planetary boundaries and social boundaries, then almost certainly yes.
Oh, well, I'll stand you in the back.
Just sort of following on from that, and you've been talking a lot about big corporate companies like Nike and all of these things. I was just wondering if you're aware of the case of Orkney in the UK, which is the only 100% sustainable place in the UK that produces 130% of its energy. It's got the European Marine Centre and all of these things, but the thing that is holding it back is the grid, and they're testing all these new things. So smart grid, and they're at the forefront of all of this, but the policy that sort of allows the way all of these things interconnect is changing. So my question really is, the way companies work here is much smaller, interconnected things, 90% intermittent renewables. They've got the smart grid to interconnect them. So seeing as innovation is coming from an area where businesses are small, and that provides some sort of model for what you're talking about, the changes.
Yeah, I think islands are really interesting, right, because they provide real sort of laboratories. I don't think it's true that Orkney is fully sustainable. I think you'll find most people still fly backwards and forwards there using kerosene, but it is becoming a hydrogen economy because rather than curtail, they're actually hydrolyzing. So, so I think it's a really interesting example. One of the one of the things I've become aware of, which is a problem of only working with the biggest companies, is that they, and therefore people like me who only work with them, often have a bit of a blind spot or a major blind spot for innovation, which often comes from outside. So I think it's something that when we think about our overall approach to systems change, we try and make sure we're finding ways of staying in touch with what innovations are popping up. I mean, Bernice Lee, who runs the Hoffman Centre at Chatham House, has done some really interesting work in the food sector and the built environment, tracking early stage capital flows, which often go to small startups, as a metric for the kind of the sort of innovative health of a sector. So I think both small companies and small islands are really useful laboratories. And the challenge for companies and for governments is to figure out how to strategically and policy-wise not exclude them from the mainstream. And it's something that I think both big companies and big governments often get wrong. So it's a really good point, right? Yeah.
And also encourage questions from women, just the point. Yeah, please.
So you spoke about a sort of changing relationship between
business and policy, and how maybe in the past lobbyists and industry would be having anti-action on climate change, but there are certain businesses now that kind of, as you said, kind of claiming the right for advocacy. I was wondering if you'd seen any changes in the relationship between like kind of economically developed countries and less developed countries, and whether some less developed countries are kind of claiming the right for advocacy, given that they're going to be the ones that are really going to face the costs of climate change.
Well, first of all, yeah, let me just make sure I haven't misled you or misunderstood the question. I think there's still very few examples of industry bodies lobbying for progressive change. Mostly I used the example of Euroelectric, which is an exception rather than the rule, but there are lots of examples of individual companies. Though interestingly, the International Chamber of Commerce has just now been, Paul Polman, who's just left Unilever, is just now chair of the International Chamber of Commerce, so I think we'll see a very different tone from them. So I think your question is really a bit about the difference between developed and developing countries. Yeah. You know, I don't know is the honest answer. I think, you know, the work we do in developing economies is really kind of Brazil, India, and China. China's just a completely different kettle of fish because it's very much government driven. So it doesn't have the same sort of lobbying. The interesting thing, I think there's a tension if I take India, which I know better, there's a tension between one sort of development narrative which says we need more power and we need it now, so we need to burn coal because we've got coal. And another one which says we don't need to follow the same development pathway as the West followed, we can leapfrog it. And I think there's a sort of ideological conversation going on right now around that question, and it's, you know, the fact that India's now got 7 of the 10 worst polluted cities in the world it sort of tilts that towards a leapfrog narrative. But you know, they have got a lot of their own coal and therefore a lot of status quo, a lot of power is anchored in the status quo. So I think it's genuinely I don't think you can say it goes one way or the other. I think there's you know, you go to a global MBA program and you become part of the global business elite. You kind of end up following the way that everyone's developed, but then you start looking at the fact that there is a possibility for leapfrogging, like in Africa or some of these other developing countries. So I think it's too soon to tell.
I was wondering, when you were talking about like social change or like value change in businesses rather than just changing how to do business in order to drive innovation and to like lead to long-term, to embed the company in a better situation. I was wondering how to actually bring about more fundamental change in the attitudes of leaders. And you know, when you were talking about having a maybe less capitalist mindset, how you can bring that about? Do you think that can only go for broader societal change? Or is there something in the thinking of leaders we can appeal to?
I think that most of the behaviour of corporate leaders is largely dictated by the system that they operate in, which is one where everybody expects their pension to appreciate faster than inflation. You know, even kind of anti-capitalist advocates normally expect, it's very weird with this cognitive dissonance. So the fundamental problem is that we all want a free lunch. Right? So we want the capitalist system to produce a nice, comfortable retirement, but we also don't want the capitalist system to work the way that it works now because it has its destructive tendencies. We've got to figure out that cognitive dissonance within our own souls, I think. So I don't think unless you change the rules of the game, you'll get different results of the game. So the rules of the game include the governance, like who's in charge, or even who's around the table. I think if you put a representative of the environment around the board, even with no votes, you'd change the conversations. Right? Of course, they also include they include the fiscal system. You know, it's not surprising that in California, the tech giants are anti-government. Most of them aren't paying very many taxes, right? So how do we pay for the roads and the schools, right? So we have to address the fiscal fairness. We have to address governance. You know, and of course we know we have to address the economic externalities. One of the things that's exciting us about this work on science-based targets is that actually it's a way of internalising the externality of climate change without putting a price on carbon. If you can get the investors to start saying, we expect you to reduce your emissions in line. So I think that it has to be a governance, investor oversight, fiscal. I think an appeal to people's better nature as leaders in a system which doesn't reward that is doomed to failure. I think we have to change the rules of the game.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, in the back, and then Josh.
On that note, so before you mentioned that you think that the current state of business could continue and we would still solve common climate change. However, businesses operate in a short-term incentive kind of world. So do you think that would need to change, or do you think it would still exist in that paradigm?
Well, so I sit on the board of the London Pension Fund, and we're trying to figure out how to manage climate risk in our portfolio. You know, and since Mark Carney and Mike Bloomberg ran this task force on climate-related financial disclosure, that conversation about climate risk is a very real one between investors and the companies they own. What I'd like to say is that increasingly it's not a climate change conversation. So it's not a climate change conversation if you're talking to the CEO of a car company about their investment in electric vehicles, right? It's just a strategic conversation. So are you going to manage this disruption, yes or no? So I think that as long as these issues really manifest as kind of front and center strategic issues, then we probably don't need to change much of the sort of fundamental rules of the game. But I might be wrong. And I would prefer it if we could move towards more long-termism. That seems like trying to use the. I mean, one of the reasons I joined CDP in 2007 was it seemed like such a brilliant kind of judo move, right? So you take the idea that investors own companies, and you say that climate change is going to change the economy. Do you, Mr. or Mrs. Investor, have enough information to know how the company that you own is responding to that set of risks and opportunities? If not, here's a solution. We'll run a disclosure platform. So we'll send a letter on behalf of you, the investor, to demand that the companies you own tell you what they're doing about climate change. So it wasn't an activist move of saying, we want you to reduce emissions. It was saying, we want to know what you're doing about this thing. So I think that there's actually quite a lot we can do, like organisations like Client Earth, using the legal system as we have it and the laws that we have, but using them to their full extent. I think similarly we can use the control that investors have over companies. If there was a way to make that more long-term, but I think in a way that this is what the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure has done. It said this is a long-term issue which could create massive systemic financial chaos if we're not on the right track. So we want companies to say what their plan is to transition to a well below 2 degree world. So I think there's a lot that can be done, but then the more we could change other rules to make it more capitalism more long term, and then obviously it would strengthen that.
John?
So you were talking about the kind of humanity of some of the people who are kind of head CEOs and partly they're kind of focused on the system they're part of, and they maybe would, did geology in the 70s or whatever. But there are also elements you talked about which are kind of like darker forces, like, for example, the media or like the Koch brothers. And if there are people who are just unequivocally trying to disrupt this transition for their own short-term benefit, like how do we tackle that if they have, in this case of the Koch brothers, so much power that they do genuinely risk the kind of vision that you suggested?
Yeah, I mean, there are crooks in every walk of life, right? In charities, in churches, in academia, and in business. But some people have way more power, right? I don't know how to deal with the Koch brothers, right? I mean, my whole, I'm a kind of a business. I'm an industrialist and a capitalist, and I kind of believe in the forces of that used for good. I think part of what I was trying to share is I think. For a long time, I kind of thought what I was doing was, I don't know what I thought I was doing. It was kind of like, I was trying to change the system because I believe that it has to change, and that unless we had business on board, we'd never get the kind of change. I wasn't thinking so much about the dark forces. What I've come to realize is that any transformation like this is fundamentally political, right? And so it is about power and money. So that if we're naive about power and money, then we'll be unlikely to succeed. So what can people do about, transparency is very powerful, right? Just pointing out. I mean, the systems develop very powerful immune systems to stop change. Like the lobbying system it's really broken, right? It's really broken the kind of relationship between business and society, because it means that there's a disproportionately influential voice that is paid for that is not acting in the interests of society. So it's asymmetrical. So what I find really powerful is to start to point out to businesses that, I mean, if a business is just, in one way, what's really refreshing is if a business leader says, I don't believe in climate change, I don't think it's going to change, I'm against any policies which force me to change, so I'm going to lobby against it. That's fine, right? It's honest. The problem is when somebody says, well, I'm for this, but is still funding that, and trying to unpick that is very difficult, because industry groups are very complex, right? Normally they're not just about climate change. So if you're a consumer goods company, you join the consumer goods forum, you talk about food labeling, you talk about Sunday trading, you talk about trade issues, you talk about sustainability, you talk about minimum wage. So at what point do you start saying, because this body that I'm a member of, because it serves me for all these things, is so far away from my position on one issue, climate change, do I start distancing myself from it? So it's really difficult, right? Because often it'll be, if it's the fourth or fifth issue, that'll never happen. They'll put all their energy into the others. So I think that there's a real role for this is where the decline in sort of investigative journalism is a real worry, right? Because that's a sort of classic thing for deep media to do. So it's not something that I work on, but I know there are people who are doing, there's a really nice group called Influence Map that tries to track the membership and the lobbying spend of companies and rank them to say how far their lobbying money is different from their public advocacy position.
Okay, I think we have time for one or two last questions. You had a question?
Yeah, so I think you mentioned about a lot of business, they started to claim that they want net zero emission, and they try kind of shifting to renewable energies. I kind of want to know more about their perspective. Do the leaders believe climate change is real, and how do they deal with the cost of shifting to renewable energy?
So it's interesting. It's always interesting as I hear your questions to try and think what the thought process is behind your question. So, do they think climate change is real? I don't think there's any business leader who's spent more than an hour reading on climate change who doesn't think that it's real, right? I mean, you kind of have to be stupid or illiterate to not understand that climate change is really happening now. And so there may be some who are still positioning themselves with a denialist position. I think that there's either a complete cognitive dissonance, the CEO of Enron being a good community churchgoer on Sunday and then a global crook on Monday. So that does happen. People dissociate their personal selves from their business selves. But I think that's more just kind of blatant dissimulation there, that they're just telling a story to serve their ends. But the vast majority of business leaders is, totally understand that it's real. They may not understand the full consequences, right? Because they may not have spent that much time reading. I do remember the CEO of Acer, the computer peripherals company, the Chairman Wang. I was out there it was about 8 years ago, and he told me that a year before, someone had asked him about climate change, and he'd thought it was completely irrelevant to his business. And then 6 months before, he'd employed a CEO, so he was chair and CEO before, and then he was just chair. So he had a bit more time to read. So he'd spent some time reading about climate change, and it decided it was one of the most important issues for his business. So I think that when people actually spend some time, it's pretty difficult not to believe that it's real. Your point about cost is a really interesting one, because the question assumes that there's a cost trade-off for taking action on climate change, right? So, I think you just need to do some more research before you ask a question like that. If you look at renewable energy, the reason that businesses are committing to it and doing it is it's locking in low, stable costs. So they see a direct business benefit. So, and I think that's increasingly what you see happening, is that businesses may start because they think they need to do something, but as they start to innovate, they realise that they're saving money, they're reducing risks. Really importantly, they're attracting and retaining talent, which is a really important factor. If you're an oil company now and you haven't got a serious renewable energy play, it's quite difficult to attract really talented engineers, right, who don't just want to work for a kind of sunset industry, but want to be providing the energy of the future. So I think of course there are times when you're very early on in any transition that it does cost more, but just beware the assumption that it always costs more to do the right thing or to act on climate change, because increasingly, and we know both macroeconomically and microeconomically, there's a benefit in acting. But it's back to my point, if you assume it's going to cost more, right, then you don't get into that reflexive future where you actually start to act, because you know that it's going to cost more, so you don't even investigate. So beware that trap. All right.
We have time for one last question. If someone wants to have the second last word. Otherwise, I'll ask one last question. Which would be, looking forward, so now that we're at the end of the event, what do you think, especially for us as sort of young people who are interested and committed to sort of taking on these issues, what will be the main, to use a strong word, battlegrounds in the fight for climate action? What will be the big sort of challenges of the future?
Well, heavy industry and food. These are two areas where there's been very little done. It's huge, both of them about a quarter of the problem, and not much progress. To the point about procurement, I mean, we need to see much stronger demand signals saying, I want lower carbon cement, lower carbon steel, or you won't be supplying me in my new building. I think also kind of the sort of cultural norms that can change quite quickly. I think of the shift to flexitarianism, let me say, rather than, because it's a sort of continuum. I mean, when I was a kid, we had meat every single day, right? And now I hardly ever have meat. And there's a big shift which many of the students here will be part of. And that's the sort of thing which can really have a huge impact without any policy or without any industry leading it. I think also the school strike, and I was talking to you, I understand there was some university students here on strike on Friday. It's also really interesting. There's some real power in speaking truth to power and saying, we're concerned, we're frightened, we're worried, we're angry that not enough's been done. I think channeling that into kind of specific ask will be quite important. But there you go, that's a few.